On July 17, 1918, Tsar Nicholas II and his family, along with the family doctor and 3 servants, were gunned down in a small room in the house in the Ural Mountains, where they had been taken to avoid possible rescue attempts. The youngest person, the Tsar's only son Alexei, was 13. Just over 50 years earlier, on May 6, 1868, the future Tsar of all the Russians, Nikolai Aleksandrovich Romanov, known in the English-speaking world as Tsar Nicholas II, was born at Tsarskoye Selo, the Tsar's village, 16 miles or so outside the then Russian capital of St. Petersburg. The Tsar's village was not a village at all, but a compound of palaces, chateaus, and government buildings. Away from the buildings of the Tsar, his extended family and favored nobility and clergy were the actual village, where the hundreds of servants lived. And while the administrative workers and servants in the Tsar's village lived in relative comfort because they lived at the Tsar's sprawling compound, and it wouldn't do for them to be seen, by the Tsar and others, living in the typical shacks that the peasants of Russia called home. By 1868, the Tsar was one of the last absolute monarchs in Europe. His will was law, and though he was surrounded by opulence, the vast majority of his people lived in abject poverty and had virtually no freedom, despite several laws that were supposed to alleviate the worst of their suffering. By contrast, just one room in one palace, the Catherine Palace of Empress Catherine the Great, the famous Amber Room, which was either destroyed or stolen during World War II, was worth between $100 million and $500 million today, and considering its historical significance, was priceless. Russia became one of the world's great powers, reaching from the Baltic and Black Seas to the Pacific and the borders of China. Ultimately, all of it belonged to the Tsar. In the later years of Nicholas's reign, a small middle class emerged in Russia's cities. The Industrial Revolution came late to Russia, and most of the growing middle class, some of whom became quite wealthy, were involved in one type of manufacturing or another. To power their factories, industrialists hired the poor. As more and more factories sprung up, peasants in the Russian countryside began to flock to the cities to find work. In Russia, even the wealthiest men in the middle class were never considered aristocrats unless the Tsar gave them a title. But many lived even grander lives than many of the lesser nobility. With their growing wealth and power, the industrialists were also the focus of great resentment on the part of the poor. In many cases, Russian peasants, often referred to as serfs, fled the estates they and their families, sometimes going back hundreds of years, had been forced to work on by the elaborate series of oppressive laws and customs that kept them living in squalor and ignorance. By the dawn of the 20th century, many of the more repressive laws prohibiting serfs from enjoying any freedom whatsoever began to be lifted. But everyone knew that whether they were lifted, written down, not written down, etc., the system that had kept the serfs down for hundreds of years was still in place. Factory workers, whether born in the cities or coming from the countryside, had virtually no rights either. Workers who were injured on the job were fired, adding an additional burden on their families. Workers who grumbled about working conditions or pay were threatened, beaten, and sometimes disappeared. Pay was meager, taxes were high, and most working and living conditions were abysmal. Tsar Nicholas II was the last ruler of the Romanov dynasty, which had begun with Michael I in 1613. For 300 years, the Romanov Tsars and the dynasties before them stood at the very top of Russian society. Below them were various branches of the family, who also enjoyed tremendous wealth and privilege. This aristocracy made up 1 to 2% of the population, but they controlled about 50% of Russia's wealth. They also owned over a third of all the arable land in Russia, which spanned over 4,000 miles from west to east and almost 3,000 from north to south. The rest belonged to the Russian Orthodox Church, the rising middle class, and a few wealthy peasants who had gained certain rights. At the bottom were the serfs, many of whom had never left the land they worked in, not only because of the limits of travel at the time, but also because it was illegal for them to leave without permission, and permission was seldom given. For centuries, mercenaries, police, and private armies tracked down runaway serfs in the same way that escaped slaves in the United States were hunted down before the Civil War. Throughout the Romanov period, peasants had rebelled. Most of these rebellions did not demand a change in the Russian government, but simply the same rights that were being enjoyed by workers and peasants in other parts of Europe, especially Western Europe and Great Britain. One of the main obstacles for the rebels was the great distances of Russia, which prevented news from traveling and caused most uprisings to be localized and relatively small. Most of them. A number of peasant uprisings did grow and gain influence, but these, like all the others, were put down with great violence. In the last half of the 1800s, though, things in the cities also began to change. This was the result of the publication and popularity of the writings of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, the fathers of communism, and a small number of others, some Russian, some not. By 1905, communism, or rather its less radical cousin, socialism, had become intensely popular among workers in Russia's major cities. With their call for workers' power and a change in working conditions, socialism and communism began gathering support. As the popularity of socialist ideas grew, the aristocrats of Russia and the richest men of the new middle class reacted more violently. In 1905, an event occurred that likely sealed the fate of the Tsar and the system that kept him in power, though no one could have guessed it at the time. On January 22, 1905, a large demonstration marched through the streets of St. Petersburg. Most of the people in the crowd were workers and included not only men, but women and children as well, many of whom worked in the factories with adults. Though the marchers were relatively peaceful, more and more people joined and called for not only change, but a complete overhaul of the system as well. At this point, and even through the revolutions which occurred in 1917, the Tsar was considered their little father, who was supposed to protect them from invasion and harm. Little Father Tsar Nicholas called out the Cossacks to end the demonstrations. Nearly 100 people were killed, and hundreds were wounded, many by sabers. Bodies lay in the street, men, women, senior citizens, and children. Russia's Bloody Sunday changed the minds of many in the country, and around the world, about the Tsar and the system of oppression in Russia. The events of Bloody Sunday did lead to some reforms, including the formation of the Duma, an elected parliament, and granting of basic civil liberties like freedom of the press, speech, assembly and association, and the legalization of trade unions. However, much of this was window dressing, and for the most part changed nothing. The Tsar or his advisors told the Duma how to vote when the Tsar even called it together. Freedom of speech only worked when no one else was around, and people deemed enemies of the state, like leading socialists and communists Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin, were never able to freely and openly associate, and large numbers of people gathered together always drew, at the very least, the attention of the secret police or local militia. Adding to Nicholas II's woes was Russia's stunning defeat at the hands of Japan in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. The Tsar, his advisors, and the Russian people were shocked by the destruction of the Russian Navy at the hands of the Japanese, and defeats on land in the Far East. Many people blame the Tsar for the defeat. In 1914, World War I began. Russia declared war on the Central Powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Turkey, along with its allies, Great Britain and France. In Russia, like in Germany, England, France, and Austria, crowds celebrated in the streets, sure of Russia's victory and eventual emergence as one of the most powerful countries in the world. Unfortunately for Russia and Nicholas, the easy victory that was predicted never came. From the outset, Russia's poorly trained and equipped troops suffered defeat after defeat. Each defeat was a blow to Russian morale, and by 1917, Russia had lost much of Belarus and Ukraine, then both part of the Russian Empire, to Germany and Austria-Hungary. By winter of 1917, hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers mutinied, or simply walked home, adding to the growing list of the Tsar's enemies. As the war went on, more and more people saw socialism and/or communism as the only way to improve their lives. The first thing was to get Russia out of the war. Approximately 2 million Russians and minority people within Russia had been killed. What's more, in cities all over the country, but especially in St. Petersburg and Moscow, more and more people began following the socialists and communists. In February/March of 1917, massive numbers of people revolted in the streets, joined by armed troops and members of the socialist parties. This is known as the February Revolution, and was not the Bolshevik or October Revolution led by Lenin. Combined with the horrible situation at the front, the repressive nature of the government, and the appeal of socialism, the marches and violence in the streets and increasing numbers of his troops marching against him, Tsar Nicholas agreed to abdicate the throne. Unfortunately for the men who led the revolution, many of whom were sons of the upper middle class, their leader, Alexander Kerensky, refused to pull Russia out of the war, and more defeats and mutinies led to his government's downfall during the Bolshevik Revolution in October. Tsar Nicholas and his family were placed under guard and initially confined to a palace in Tsarskoye Selo. They were then moved to the governor's mansion in the city of Tobolsk in Siberia. While the mansion was by no means as luxurious as his many palaces throughout the country, the mansion was nice, private, and offered the former Tsar and his family some privacy and a semblance of normalcy. They were able to play games, grow a garden, and live in relative peace. However, when the Bolsheviks overthrew Kerensky's provisional government, they decided to move the Tsar and his family to a smaller house in the city of Ekaterinburg in central Russia, far away from crucial events and their former center of power. At the time, Lenin and the Bolsheviks controlled large parts of Russia, but not close to all of it. Shortly after they came to power in St. Petersburg, the Russian Civil War began between the Bolsheviks, known as the Reds, and their supporters and the supporters of the Tsarist system, mainly army officers and leading men from outside the main cities, called the Whites. To most of these men, the return of the Tsar was a rallying cry. At the time, the Bolsheviks were still working out how they would govern the country, and in the early days of their regime, local committees called Soviets, made up of communists and other radical citizens, controlled and governed regions across the country. The men and women of the Ural Soviet decided on their own, and likely not with the input from Lenin, to execute the Tsar and his family. This was done not only to prevent them becoming even more of a rallying point for anti-communist forces, but, to be honest, as revenge for the abuses, not only of Tsar Nicholas, but of the many Tsars who preceded him, some of whom were far more brutal than Nicholas, who was a relatively mild and friendly family man in person. Told they were going to be photographed to prove to the world they were still alive, but moved to a more secure location, the Tsar, his hated wife Alexandra, who was said to be the power behind the throne, and their children were brought to the parlor of Ipatiev House in Yekaterinburg, where they were confined. The Tsar's children were Olga, 22, Tatiana, 21, Maria, 19, Anastasia, 17, and Alexei, 13, the future Tsar who famously suffered from hemophilia. Once the family and their servants had been positioned for a picture, the commander of the guard, a secret policeman named Yakov Mikhailovich Yurovsky, told the former Tsar that the Ural Soviet had decreed that they were to be executed. The Tsar and his family had not said a word the entire time, and Nicholas began to move forward to protest, but Yurovsky shot him in the chest. When he fell to the ground, he was shot again, multiple times. As the men accompanying Yurovsky opened fire on the family and servants, all of whom were shot multiple times, the girls and their mother screaming in terror. Prince Alexei was also shot in the chest, but as Yurovsky moved about the room with his pistol, the prince was still moving. He was then shot multiple times. Yurovsky moved about the room, and when he came to the Tsar's lifeless body, he reportedly shot him again, then kicked him in the face. Despite rumors that began shortly after the killings, Anastasia was killed along with her family, something that was later proved through DNA testing. Immediately after the shooting, the bodies were taken to an area called the Four Brothers Mine. Valuables strewn into their clothing were taken and then they were repeatedly stabbed, and some witnesses claim an attempt was made to burn the bodies. What was left of the bodies were then dumped into a deep mass grave. None of the Bolsheviks wanted the bodies of the Tsar and his family to be paraded around for cameras if the Whites recaptured the area, which never did happen. In 1979, some of the remains were pulled from the grave, but it was not until 1991 that all of what remained of the bodies were exhumed and examined. DNA testing proved exactly who they were, including Anastasia, though rumors of her being alive lived on. The Ipatiev house where the Tsar and his family were killed was destroyed by the Soviets in 1977, in a further attempt to erase not only what happened there, but to remove any place any potential opposition might rally to and around. From 2000 to 2003, the post-communist Russian government built the Church on Blood in honor of All Saints Resplendent in the Russian land on the place where they were killed. On July 17, 1998, the Russian government ordered the reburial of the remains in the St. Peter and Paul Church in St. Petersburg, the traditional burial place for the Romanovs. In August 2000, the Russian Orthodox Church declared Nicholas to be a saint and his family passion bearers. And today, at least in theory, Nicholas and his family are venerated in Russia, despite the fact that millions suffered under the yoke of the Tsars.